This week, the New York Rangers put Chris Kreider on the trade block, and he instantly becomes not just the most interesting player available, but the best. Considering his goal-scoring history, almost every single team out there is going to be interested. But what teams make the most sense for Kreider, and what teams could actually make the cap hit and the trade work in the end? Well, today we're going to be going through 10 different NHL teams that I could see as potential Chris Kreider trade destinations. You're going to want to watch till the end because there's a few teams here that you might not assume are in the Chris Kreider negotiations, but I do think stand a chance. So is your favorite team in the race for Kreider? Can they get a deal done? And what could a Kreider trade actually look like when it's all said and done? Well, make sure you watch till the end because we're going to be going through every scenario, every possibility, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. I've been a big fan of what Kreider's been able to accomplish in the NHL for a while now with his goal scoring consistency and what we've seen out of that. I mean, just 52 goals in 81 games a couple of seasons ago in 2022. We've seen the production dip a little bit though, and especially compared to last season where he got 75 points, he's down to only 9 goals, 9 points in 19 games to start out this season. And it seems like for the Rangers, a team that is desperate in need of a change, Kreider is one of the players out there being dangled. Personally, if I was New York, I wouldn't end up dealing it, but they want to send a message, and Kreider is one of the more easier contracts out of the core to send out, only making $6.5 million for the next 2 seasons after this. And although he has a 15-team no trade clause, I think almost every team would at least inquire about Kreider because why wouldn't you? He's a perfect fit for a lot of teams out there looking for that playoff edge. And especially for that playoff performance, I think a lot of teams are going to be going after that. I mean, over the last 3 playoff runs, he's been really consistent in that regard. 10 goals in 20 games back in 2022, 6 goals in 7 games back in 2023, and then this last year in 2024, got 8 goals in 16 games. You know what you're getting out of Chris Kreider, and I think a lot of teams are going to want that dependability, even if this start of the season hasn't been up to snuff. And that leads me on to this fascinating article by Bleacher Report talking about 6 trade landing spots for New York Rangers star Chris Kreider amid all of the NHL trade rumors. Now, we're going to go through these 6 landing spots, and then I'm also going to include 4 extra ones of my own, teams that I could also see being in the mix for him. But we're going to go through all these teams and see what a deal could look like. The first team the Bleacher Report puts out there is the Chicago Blackhawks, which is a pretty big surprise to me. Not a team that I would usually suspect in the Chris Kreider negotiations. Joe says the Chicago Blackhawks spent a lot of money last summer to make the team more mature and competitive to surround Connor Bedard. That hasn't exactly worked out as they hoped, but adding a presence like Kreider would ideally provide a jolt. His competitive spirit is intense, and he's exactly the player that fits what Chicago is looking for while they continue the rebuild. It's the rebuild aspect as well as making the money work that would get in the way of any deal. Kreider has a 15-team no trade clause, and with Chicago among the worst teams in the league, despite how good rate of a city it is, it's hard to see Kreider being cool going from a Stanley Cup contender to a #1 pick contender. Plus, for all the cap space Chicago has, adding Kreider's salary alone will put them near the cap ceiling, which would be an extra tough look given the team's record. Now, I personally do agree with that, especially with the trade clause. That is a situation that I don't think a lot of people are considering here. Yes, it is only about half of the league, a little bit less than that at 15 teams, but it is a factor. And for a lot of these more rebuilding teams that would have the cap space to bring in a player like Kreider, it limits the options. And I think in a Kreider's case, Chicago is likely one of those teams on that trade clause. Now, just because that is the case doesn't mean that Kreider wouldn't accept a deal, but I just feel like Kreider's one of those players that might not accept a trade clause, would want to stay in New York and make that situation work in the end. So I think that trade clause would affect a lot. But I also think you got to consider Chicago's position here, because even though I think Kreider will be a great fit for that top 6 and would bring some juice that I think they desperately need, you also got to consider the age. He's 33 years old, and by the time that Chicago is actually in a winning position, Kreider's likely going to be on his way out, and maybe he's still there in a veteran role, but he's not going to be what he's used to be. He's already declining in his own ways, and I just feel like for Chicago, for how much Kreider would cost, I just don't really see it as being all that worth it. If Chicago went for the type of player that Kreider is 5 years earlier, then maybe I think it would work out pretty well. But at 33 years old, I just don't see Kreider as a fit for this timeline that Chicago has, at least at this stage, especially with what it would cost. That's the reason why they went after players on the free agent side like Bertuzzi and Pat Maroon and Teuvo Teravainen to try to shore that up, because it's free. You don't have to give up picks and prospects and this whole prospect cupboard that you built to make it happen. And I just see that being the thing that really holds it back. Maybe I'm wrong though, and it's one of the big wingers on Chicago going the other way to New York as one of the main centerpieces. Maybe a player like Teuvo Teravainen could be interesting as an ad for New York, but I just don't really see that being a pure replacement for them. There would still probably have to be a little bit more on top of that at the very least, and I don't know if Chicago is in the position to stomach that. Now, they go on to say that the Bruins are in the middle of turning their season around after firing Jim Montgomery. Bringing Boston native Chris Kreider back home be the kind of homecoming that on paper would make a ton of sense. Kreider's style of play is a perfect fit for how the Bruins play. He's physical, got a nasty side, and he scores goals all around the front of the net. He's the exact kind of player the Bees don't have right now. That said, going back home could spark Kreider alive, but a deal with a fellow Original Six franchise and a potential playoff rival could be enough detriment that general manager Chris Drury would hold off making a deal. Now, honestly, I don't think them being in the same conference as a potential playoff rival matters much to Drury. I think the problem is actually making a deal work. The big problem I see in any Kreider to Boston deal is the cap space. Right now, the Bruins have about $800K in cap, and that's not enough to bring in a Kreider. just a little bit below what they need for that. So they would have to have a major hockey trade to actually make this deal work. I don't think it's impossible, but it would require multiple players going back to the Rangers. First, I think Trent Frederick would be the easy one. Already in trade negotiations over the past couple months. He's somebody making around $2.3 million, so you'd have him coming back, which I think is a pretty easy deal to make. But I also think you'd have to send out a defenseman, either a Brandon Carlo or a Nikita Zadorov already out the door. Carlo makes the most sense considering we've also heard his name around trade rumors here and there. He's somebody the Bruins have floated around as well, and I think could be a pretty interesting fit for the Rangers. So it would have to be Frederick and Carlo going back to the Rangers, and I don't even know what that deal looks like after that. I think for the Bruins, they might even still have to add after that, maybe a pick or a prospect on top of it, but it is something that I think could be worth it for the Bruins. But at the same time, the cap finagling that would have to happen would be pretty intense, and I just see it being a lot easier to ship him off to a team with some cap space to work with. But the Bruins are desperate. They already fired their head coach, so maybe there's a trade in the works there potentially. Kreider would be pretty fun. That left side, Kreider and Marchand would be just hell to deal with. Now on to the next team here, speculated about Chris Kreider, and next up they have the Vegas Golden Knights. Of course they're on this list. Now the Knights would be even more funny because they have the least amount of cap space in the entire league. I think they're working with like 70K right now, which also isn't enough to get Kreider, so there would have to be some major transactions going the other way. I guess there's options on Vegas, but I don't think they're players that Vegas would want to trade in the first place. Pavel Dorofeyev would be an option, and I think would be the guy I would be looking for from the Rangers, but he has been so good for Vegas this year, and especially in a goal-scoring role, he's somebody that I would keep if I'm them, especially at his young age. You also look at the defense, and a player like Shea Theodore could have been an interesting one, but of course, he just extended to that massive contract with Vegas, so I don't think he ends up getting moved. Maybe there's the potential in a player like White Cloud or a Hague, but there would have to be multiple of those type of cap situations going back to the Rangers, and I just don't know if Vegas is in a position to make it work. They've done crazier things before, I will say that, but as of right now, I just don't see it happening. Plus, they've been in a pretty good position to start out the year, and their left side is already pretty good with Barbashev and Hurdle, so I don't know how much they're willing to change that. Unless Kreider can play right wing for them, which I think could be a pretty interesting position, I just don't see a Vegas trade happening. I'm sorry, folks. Though imagine Vegas puts Mark Stone on LTR again, and that's how they get Kreider. That wouldn't surprise me. Now let's keep going and go on to the next team mentioned, and this is one that we talked about before in that Rangers retool video that I thought could be an option for Kreider. That's Utah. Now they started out by talking about how much cap space Utah has, which is a major factor in a potential Chris Kreider trade, and talking about the lack of physicality in the four group, with exceptions there, of course, with players like Lawson Krause, but most of that core is young, skill-based. Now, like we talked about in that video, to me, it all depends on how desperate Utah is to add somebody into that top six, because I don't know if they necessarily need Kreider, but he would certainly be a different type of forward into that group, which could be a big benefit for them, especially if they are trying to still compete towards the trade deadline and for the second half of this year. But even in that case, Kreider is not a rental. He's somebody that has 2 years left after this, so is somebody that I think could mentor a lot of those young guys pretty well and could easily slot in to that second line left wing spot, even though Jack Big Bane is doing very well right now. The problem for me is, like we mentioned, with a player like Lawson Krause, is one of the more physical exceptions in that four group. To me, he would be one of the guys dealt and would be probably the #1 forward, I would say, that New York would want to acquire in a Kreider trade. I don't think they're going to go for skill in a Kreider trade necessarily. I think they're going to want to get a type of replacement, and Krause, I think, would pretty much fit that bill perfectly. He's somebody that hasn't gotten off to the greatest start this season, just 4 points, 3 goals in 22 games, but last year had 42 points, and the year before that, 45 points. He's proven himself as a pretty good goal scorer, and I think in New York with a change of scenery, that could be what's good for him in the future. But still 27 years old, he's somebody that is right in the prime of his career, or at least should be in the prime of his career in terms of point production. He's somebody the Rangers could get a lot from, though, and I think could be a really good addition. At least if we're talking about this mini retool the Rangers might go in, Krause is somebody I think the Rangers should be targeting. And who knows, maybe there's more to a potential trade of Utah. Of course, I think they're always looking for defense, especially on that right side. And of course, we know a lot about Trouba and potentially a Keandre Miller deal, and even some players like Ryan Lindgren as well that could potentially be dealt. So I think for Utah, maybe they could stand to add a defenseman as well from New York, and maybe that's in exchange for another forward like a Carcone, or maybe even they trade for Nick Schmaltz from all this. Who knows? There's a lot of options out there, but I think it's going to be interesting if Utah is in the mix. Now we keep going and on to the 15 mentioned here. We go on to the Buffalo Sabres. Now I don't see a Kreider to the Sabres deal happening. We talked about this as well in that retool video, even though I think it would be perfect, genuinely perfect for the Sabres to go after Kreider. I just don't see it. You look at that Buffalo lineup, man, and if they had another power forward and they could add him onto that top line on that left wing, it would be absolutely perfect. You could have Paterka on the second line, you could have Benson on the third, or whatever you wanted to do there. You would have so many more options in that top six, especially for the power play. It would give them some more physicality, some more grit, and especially on the power play, some bang and crash ability, which I think they could use. So much could be solved by trading for Kreider. The problem is that no move clause. I think there is the chance that Kreider does waive that no move clause, even though I think it's a little bit less likely, but is going to waive it for Buffalo? I just don't think so. I don't think any player, especially in Kreider's position, would waive for Buffalo, and I think that's something that's going to be a problem here in this negotiation. Even though it would be perfect, and I think Buffalo absolutely has the options to give New York, I just don't see it happening because of Kreider's trade protection, and unfortunately, a golden opportunity, golden ticket by Buffalo being wasted because of that. I think it would have been perfect too, because you could offer a struggling younger player like Jack Quinn, who I think could be pretty interesting on the Rangers middle six on that right side, but alas, I just don't think it is meant to be. And then on to the last team that Bleacher Reports mentions here as a potential Kreider fit is the Anaheim Ducks, and this is one that I really was interested in when we talked about it a couple days back. I think Anaheim could genuinely be an interesting one here. Again, it all really depends on the trade protection, but man, in terms of fit, I would be so excited for this. In terms of cap space, Anaheim has all of it. In terms of players that I think the Rangers would be interested in, Anaheim has a ton of options like Zegras and Vetrano, who I think could easily be fits on the Rangers almost immediately. In terms of position, I think Kreider would fit perfectly with some of the playmakers there, like Troy, like a Leo Carlson, for example. Once he comes back, there is, I think, some good potential there. And I think Anaheim is also a team that loves those type of players. I mean, they signed Alex Killorn, who is Kreider-like, and or really Kreider-light, for example, and he's somebody that I think Pat Verbeek would really want to add. But again, I think the only problem is, what does Kreider think in all this? Does he want to go to California? I mean, he's played on the East Coast throughout his entire career, going from Boston College in the NCAA right to the Rangers, and hasn't looked back since then. So this is really the first opportunity he's had to play somewhere other than the East Coast. Does he actually want to do that? Does he want to go to California, where it's maybe a little bit nicer than Buffalo? Does that factor in to the no trade clause there? And if he waives that, there's a lot of wrinkles in this, but I think if any team stands to benefit from Kreider's addition, it is Anaheim, especially with the identity they're trying to build. Kreider is basically that player. And especially for the Rangers, I think out of almost all the teams we mentioned here, they can benefit from the players going back. If it's a player like Zegras especially, I think he is really badly due for a change of scenery, and I think could really benefit from the need of speed and skill in that Rangers system, and of course the attention that New York gets. I think Zegras is better when the spotlight is on him, and I think we'd see him really thrive there. Sadly, I think just like the Buffalo situation, the trade protection might hurt a trade from happening, but man, I think Anaheim would be special, and I think would be a lot of fun to see a deal happen, because it would be crazy no matter what. Now, we went through some of the teams that Bleacher Report mentioned, but I want to go through 4 other teams that I could also see in the Kreider sweepstakes, teams that we talked about before, but also some teams that I think are worth your consideration in a potential Kreider deal. The first team I wanted to talk about here is the LA Kings, who I mean could really stand to make a trade with the Rangers, whether that's for a Trouba or a Kreider potentially. I mean, the Kings have a lot of options on the forward group that I think the Rangers would potentially like to add to that top 6. Players like Kevin Fiala, Trevor Moore, and even outside of that, players like Arthur Kaliev, who I think could really use a change of scenery. I've already asked for trades in the past. I think he could be really interesting on a bottom 6. I still think has value in the NHL someday. So I think for the Kings, they have a lot of options there. And they also have the cap space, over $10 million right now to work with because of Drew Doughty's contract beyond LTIR. There's the potential to add on another deal, and especially in Kreider's case, add in some real value. I think especially with the Kings and them trying to build this brand of being hard to play against, Kreider is up that alley, and if they want to get more out of Kopitar and Doughty while they're still at the top of their games, Kreider could fit in that timeline pretty perfectly. And what has been the Kings' problem year after year? It's been the scoring in the playoffs. And what does Kreider do year after year? Score in the playoffs. maybe it's a different situation in LA with the lack of goal scoring around him, but Kreider does what LA doesn't, and I think that's exactly the type of player they might stand to benefit from. Another team that I think could be really interesting is the Winnipeg Jets. Now, I think the big thing that holds back a deal is just the fact that the Jets don't need to make a trade. They have been so amazing to start out this season. Of course, the brilliant undefeated record to start out the year, and in the Jets' case, their offense has been rolling in a lot of key ways, especially on the power play where it's always been good. So I don't think the Jets really need another power play guy to add to their group. But I do think if they want to get even better, if they want to use this momentum in an even better way, there is the potential to do that. I mean, I think he could easily sit in that Cole Perfetti spot on that second line left wing, bring some power play ability, especially the playmaking ability of Ehlers. That could be a pretty interesting duo there. I could easily see Perfetti as well being the guy going back to the Rangers and getting a change of scenery, which could be a good thing for him too. And the Jets getting even stronger as they look to really contend for this year's playoffs. Again, I don't see it as too likely, especially since there's going to be some cap space situations there that the Jets would really have to make their way through to make a deal happen. But I think it could be very interesting, and especially with the core there and it being a little bit on the older side, Kreider fits that pretty well. That window that Winnipeg has, Kreider is right in it. The thing is, though, for me, I think Winnipeg would stand better from a more 5-on-5 speed-oriented addition, but in Kreider's case, he would make their strengths even stronger, and if that's something the Jets want to do, then so be it. Though, considering really the lack of many trades besides really the Gabe Vilardi, Pierre-Luc Dubois deal, I don't know how much Winnipeg is really willing to be active, especially when things are going so well right now. Another team that I think has to be in the mix is the Nashville Predators, a team that I think could really stand to make another addition. They're somebody that has already been heavily active in the trade market with the Philip Tomasino trade, going for Ryder Rolston as well from Chicago, but I think they could stand to make an even bigger deal and add to that four group. I mean, a player like Steven Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault, players that already brought in have been pretty disappointing so far. Chris Kreider, though, could be pretty interesting to rejuvenate that group, even though I think for Nashville, the bigger need might be in the center position. Still, though, I think Nashville has a couple interesting players that New York would want to go after. Luke Evangelista is somebody that's been all up and down throughout the season in terms of his ice time, his deployment. We talked about him in a potential David Jiricek trade, but I think the Rangers could also get a lot from him as well. Somebody that was hovering around the 35-40 point range last year, and I think could still get back to that and be even better. Of course, with Nashville's struggling start to the year, they might be in a position where they want to overreact and make a big deal, and the Rangers could be a team to take advantage of that. And the last team I wanted to mention here as kind of a more out of their idea is the St. Louis Blues. Now, hear me out. I don't think it would include a Jake Neighbors or something, even though that could be an interesting fit. I think if we were to see a Kreider deal to St. Louis, there would have to be some heavy salary back. So this is a situation where I think there would have to be a major player going back the other way to the Rangers. I think maybe your mind might gravitate towards more of the defensive side with a player like Colin Parayko potentially going back, especially if the Rangers are going to be trading a player like Trouba or a Keandre Miller. But what if, and here is just an out there idea, what if Pavel Buchnevich returned to the New York Rangers? His situation to start of this season has not been all that well. He signed that major extension, and so far the production hasn't really been there. They've tried him at center, and that hasn't really worked out. Now with Robert Thomas back, they're putting him back on the wing, but so far the start to the season has not been good for him, and we know how good he can be when he is healthy, when he is on the top of his game. That's somebody I think the Rangers could really stand to benefit from. Of course, maybe it would be a little bit of revenge for how bad that trade was going to St. Louis in the first place, but we'll have to wait and see on that. I think even though it's not likely whatsoever, the idea gets me pretty excited. But those are some of the teams I could see being in the Chris Kreider sweepstakes, and I'd love to hear down below your thoughts on these teams. Where do you see it actually happening? What teams do you see being the most likely to trade for Kreider, and if your team should trade for Kreider in the end? Let me know all your thoughts down below, and of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online to get the Kreider trade rumors out there to them, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.